Follow me with your shape-shifting smiles and I see you. Maybe they'll believe you. Illuminati, occult dawn trial, silver discs and hidden files, and we see you. We've got to believe you. Blast off. Blast off. Blast off. Blast off.
Blast off on an epic episode of the Hyper Anomalous Esoteric Research Organization podcast, also known as Hero Paranormal. My name's Ryan, the alien anthropologist of the airwaves, bringing you an amazing episode today. Before we do, if you haven't been over to heroparanormal.com, check it out. For the price of a cup of coffee a month, you can access all the content over there. There's a ton of it. There's also a little eBay store, which if you order anything, I'll be the one sending you a book, a hat, a t-shirt, whatever it is. All that helps keep the podcast going. Enough about that. Let me talk about our guest today. He is something else. Brian Jackson, who has researched Dan Burisch more than anyone. He has an amazing archive, and he is the man to talk to when you want to know about this enigma. Now, Brian has 13 years dedicated to researching the controversial claims of Dan Burisch, and a total of 37, I said that right, 37 years investigating UFOs and UAPs. Brian's journey began in the early internet era when he started looking into this, and he found information on platforms like Fido.net, Paranet, and others. And this foundational research led him down this amazing rabbit hole. Involving traditional methods, collaboration with prominent figures, he has consistently focused on critical areas, including Area 51, the Papoose Lake facilities, super top secret locations, underground installations, and my lab abduction phenomena. He did a ton of research into this stuff, and despite contributing significant data to the field, Brian has intentionally remained out of the spotlight. He's taken a behind-the-scenes approach, and he's very much a behind-the-scenes researcher. He's a graduate of the Art Center College of Design in Pasadena, California, and resides in Los Angeles. Here is his website. Check it out. And man, oh man, is it amazing. It has a ton of information, videos, pictures, stuff you're not going to find anywhere else. The guy knows more about Dan Burisch than anybody I've come across, and I'd like to thank Eric for setting this up. You know who you are. Let's get to it. Brian Jackson, welcome to the Hero Paranormal Podcast.
Thank you. Great to be here, Ryan. Appreciate it.
This is a pleasure because this is an individual that I've been mesmerized with since I first saw him. I had a brief encounter with him, and
oh, is that right?
It was larger than life, and for what seemed like an ordinary guy, and you have delved more deeply into this rabbit hole than absolutely anyone. Plenty of people near the top rungs of intelligence are aware of this also. And I guess I'm not sure where to kick this off, because this is a pretty, it's such a big thing. Like an hour is really almost not enough. Let me do this before we start talking about Dan Burisch. And for those who are unfamiliar, he is someone very mixed in with Area 51 and aliens and J-Rod. But before we go into that, can I ask you about your research in the 90s on abductees? Because I think that will kind of aim us in that direction.
Yeah, ironically, one of my first exposures to ufology in the world of research was when I attended a talk by who would ultimately be the lead investigator of the Dan Burisch case, and that is Bill Hamilton. And it's around 1990. I attended a talk, and he had some guests with him that were milab abductees. Now, abduction itself, and especially back then, was a very difficult concept to kind of rationalize in your head. But these guests that he had talked about these things in very real terms, and especially also the covert military side and the surveillance being done on them, of which they had photographs and various kinds of documentation showing their phones are being tapped. And that was an odd avenue into the abduction scenario, but that was my way into it. And I've since befriended quite a number of victims of milab, and tried to help them with some of the aspects of finding out who the surveillance culprits are and things like that. But yeah, abduction was an early kind of gateway into the subject for me personally. I'm not an experiencer, however.
And the 90s were, it seems to me, I don't know if I'm just getting older, which I am, but it seems to me like the 90s were very intense when it came to abductions.
Yeah, that's really an interesting observation, because I almost feel like there has been an evolution of the abduction scenario from what I've learned in the 90s to where we are now. But I have to say, just in recent weeks, I've had that feeling almost reversed. And what I mean by that is, early on, abductions were about hybridization. And people were being taken out of the rooms, missing time, being brought back into the rooms, disheveled, things aren't quite right. They know something happened to them. And I feel like I hadn't, like just this past 10 years, I feel like I haven't heard that many people having that same scenario. And I also want to kind of keep myself in check. I mean, maybe I'm just not exposed to the right channels where this is being talked about. But on Twitter X, there are quite a few spaces that go up where people are still talking today about these things happening to them. So it was kind of a eye-opening thing for me. I think, unlike my feeling that it had one, period of time where it was active and not, I think I'm wrong. I think it is active. I don't know why we don't hear about it as much, unless you're in certain channels like Twitter, but yeah, it's a fascinating aspect. And also one, obviously, that is a darker side to this subject that doesn't like to be discussed much.
I think that might be part of it. I think you nailed it with that comment, because it seems as if there's more traction in the arena of love and light, our cosmic space brothers, books like UFO of God or Stephen Greer with CE5, where there's nothing to worry about. These entities are all our friends. And when you look into the deep research, as you said, there are some dark corners.
Very. Yeah, and recently I've befriended somebody on Twitter X who's very intelligent, used to be a investigator, I think, for a police force. And she's having regular abductions, and she's connecting with others by virtue of her X spaces that she puts on. And some of these are mothers of children, and the children are being taken. I mean, these are really, really scary, dark things to rationalize and discuss. So yeah, it seems that, and we don't have to go down this road right now, but it also seems like there's a narrative that is being controlled about what is a proper exposure of the subject of UFOs. We can talk about blurry pictures, we can talk about whistleblowers, we can talk about hearings. We don't talk about abductions.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a glaring, odd kind of observation that I'm making. And I think other people, maybe such as yourself, seen as well.
100%. It seems that way. And there's a lot of control. And, instead of painting ourselves into that corner, which it's a very real aspect, unfortunately, let's delve into Dr. Dan Burisch, PhD. And I highly recommend that anyone listening go to the following website, and burisharchive.com, and you must watch the 5-part video that is very detailed with Brian Jackson narrating. It is a must watch if you're interested in this. And with that, Brian, let you take it from here.
Yeah, so the website I'm extremely proud of. It came out of my talk at a symposium in San Francisco called UFOCon 2025. And in the audience was John Ramirez, Jason Sands, and Bob McGuire. And we had really good conversation afterwards. And I realized from that talk and the conversations I was having that I need to direct somebody to my research. I can't always give a presentation or do an interview like this. Thank you for the opportunity. But I decided, I'm going to collate the material I have and put it up so that I can at least direct somebody to it if I get into dialogue or discourse about aspects of Dan's case. And so that was the genesis of why I did it. And there's more to come. I have to say that I have more I want to put up. But at the very basic level, it is a resource for all of the videos of Dan and the many interviews he's done, my research of his documentation that supports anecdotally and almost directly his claims of what he worked on in the program. And also, to be fair, I put up some arguments and some challenges against those arguments so people can see, because there's popular challenges to Dan's case, and it's usually, ironically, 2 sources: George Knapp, an article he wrote in 2005, and also a website called UFO Watchdog. And so, yeah, I thought I'd put those up as well, and challenges against those arguments. So, yeah, it's a good resource. I think it will be a really good resource. And it's also led me to some good contacts. On there is my contact info, private contact, and it's already led to some interesting connections. Yeah.
That is great introduction, because this is, an interesting, it's a tapestry, like any of our lives. And George Knapp, I'm very familiar with George Knapp, and he is just a human being. He is just a researcher. And getting back to Dan's humanity, there is a really interesting thing about Dan. When you see Dan or talk to Dan, and I'm sure you have a lot more knowledge of this than I do. He's not a showboater. He's not. He's very humble. He's very reserved. He's very. I dare I use the word meek. And yet, when I saw him, I was shocked. I believe he had at the time what people would most likely these days call a handler, a very large woman. And I want to say she was from the Eastern Bloc. I used to know the country, but I don't anymore. But she was massive. And she also sort of served as security, it seemed, for him. And it wasn't just myself. A close friend of mine, Alien Dave Rosenfeld, also got to see Dan. And he sat directly behind Dan. And interestingly, he said that he had something on the back of his head. And it almost appeared as if, and these are his words, not mine, like in the Matrix, like something could be plugged in. And I said, come on. And I but these are the issues with Dan. You get a little bit of traction, and then there's a lot of exponential stuff that goes from there. I was shocked. For those who are unfamiliar, he interacted allegedly with an alien species known as J-Rod, but then I found that J-Rod is not actually, or at least it's my understanding, not the name of the alien, but the name of the race of the alien.
Right.
Could we expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, and by the way, I'm not sure what your friend saw, but I do know that Dan had a very, very harsh attack on him when he was a little boy in elementary school. He was hit with a metal bar in the back of his head. And and that would provide lifelong health issues to him that required medication constantly. So that might have been some byproduct or artifact of that. He said it was he was hit on the back of the head. Yeah, the J-Rod is a species. The J-Rod is a future human lineage, if we're to believe the research of Dan himself. On a very microbiological DNA level, he said this is a human being. And he would ultimately find the splitting of humanity after a major catastrophe that happens in our future that causes the physical change to our humanity because of the environment by which we are going to need to live. A very dark environment. Eyes get bigger, intelligence grows, head gets bigger. So there's a story behind how that happens from a physiological level, and that we do harness time travel. So that the story, and Dan is very open to the idea that there are, of course, other species. He's familiar with the J-Rod types, with which he calls them the P plus 52s and the P plus 45s. Those are respectively 52,000 years into the evolution of our future human lineage, and 45,000. But also another break off of humanity is the Nordics, or the Orions, he calls them. Now, if he's asked about things like insectoids or other types, he says, listen, I don't know, and I'm not going to prejudge, but I do know about this species. And this is what I worked with. So
now this is huge, and I don't know if it's just I always deal with this, but it seems like my experience for my own growth always seems to happen at the exact right time. Some people call this synchronicities or luck or coincidence. And the reason why that matters is just in April, last month of this year, a comment by the White House science advisor has gone viral. And he's literally said and claimed that the United States had technology that could manipulate time and space. And I think this is important because this is the sort of thing that Dan was alluding to. And even in other circles that are not UFO related, like cryptocurrency circles, some are claiming that Satoshi now, which is really strange for the crypto bros to get on board with this, but they're claiming that Satoshi may be a time traveling human from the future that came back to interact with the financial system and add a different sort of currency because of future events. So this is really kind of collaborative and coincidental that this is all transpiring, and then I got an opportunity to talk to you because Dan very much seemed to have involvement that, well, let's just say that his credentials have come into question multiple times, but his involvement with some of these locations seems pretty obvious, correct?
Well, it's difficult because when we take the claims of Dr. Dan Burisch, and the elephant in the room here, by the way, to your viewers, is this is a case that was popular in the early 2000s, and around 2007, it went dark. And it's only now that I'm trying to resurrect it because I'm hearing a whole new generation of people coming into this that are open to the idea of some of the things that Dan was claiming back then. And that's why I term my presentation Refocusing the Dan Burisch Story. Yeah, there's a tremendous amount of material now that can be recontextualized today and make sense based on things that recent whistleblowers have been saying in hearings, David Grush and Jake Barber, and things where there's little bits and pieces that fill some of the gaps that were questionable to Dan's story back then. So I think we have to reconsider some of his claims, because if we're to believe everything that he claims, he was a representative of this very, very deep alternative government operation that's not that does not report to the executive branch at all. They operate behind the scenes. Most of the people, the higher ups in Washington, are aware that this group operates for the betterment of mankind and humanity, and they have to do things that are sometimes dark. And at this point, Dan is now supposedly retired from that group, but lives quietly in Canada, surrounded by handlers and a doctor. So I'm not sure where we want to go next with the subject, but yeah, it's important to know that this was a very big case back in the day. And it was very controversial because there's no ways to claim all of these things. We couldn't be in the room with Dan when these discussions were happening with the deep state group. We couldn't be there with him in the clean sphere at S4 when he's interacting with the J-Rod. We couldn't have his acuity in the sciences and be with him when he discovered the connection to humanity, along with his colleague, Dr. Arthur Price, who also was there at the same time, who went on to work with Kit Green at the CIA. We couldn't be there for all of that. So what I spent most of my time doing when I decided to investigate this, evident on the website, let's find out if Dan is who he claims he is, period. Let's find out his acuity in the sciences. Let's find out if he had the education he had. Let's find out if he really did speak at Caltech like he said he did, which he did. These don't strike me as the kind of individual that was having to deflect these claims of being, a charlatan, a fraud. That doesn't strike well with me when you've got such a substantial amount of evidence that supports at least the things that usually people go to first. Well, did he get a PhD? Yes, he did get a PhD. I proved that on the website. There's many ways we found out that did exist. Did he work at Area 51? I have now the Tom Mack letter, if you're familiar with what that is. It was a handwritten letter from one Air Force intelligence person to another. And one of those I befriended some time ago. And I said, do you really have correspondences from this other person? They said, yes, I have one handwritten letter. And within 45 minutes, he scanned it and sent it to me. And there's Dan's name being referenced in 1999, this was a 1999 letter, being referenced back in the 80s as working at Area 51 on the alien doing DNA work. So that was fascinating to me. But, we have to take all this into consideration when we're hearing now about these new whistleblowers and new claims from new people that I think are starting to fill these holes that Dan made back then.
I think they are. And the neuropathy really struck a chord with me because this is something that I've encountered researching certain things in close proximity after the fact. And so it would only make sense in my mind that this would also happen when the roles are reversed, right? When these entities are interacting here. And the interesting thing about Dan Burisch is and I'm friends with George Knapp, so I have to be careful here, but he never, in my opinion, was after money, glory, any of that. And he never reaped any benefits from this. And, we do have people like George Knapp, Jeremy Corbell, of course, all the usual players that seem to be, the charging forward with this disclosure. Lou Elizondo comes to mind and a number of others. And many of the same names pop up, like Kit Green. And, Kit has some very interesting stuff that was either legitimately stolen off of his desk or leaked on purpose. Nobody's exactly sure. These brain scans of people who are being studied, over 100 people being studied who are in close proximity to this high strangeness or extraterrestrial craft or propulsion systems, etc. And they very much are encountering what they're calling interference syndrome, which is basically a form of neuropathy where parts of the brain are sort of dying, but yet these people are able to function at not just legitimate levels, but in many cases, it seems as if they're almost getting downloads, and they're very intelligent and their IQ actually goes up. There's a number of people I could think of off the top of my head, But Gary Nolan is also involved in these studies, as you mentioned, Kit Green. And this has been going on for quite some time. Even as you look at and research this work, it goes back to that time frame that Dan was claiming similar stuff. Now, back to Dan never really striking me as a charlatan or a grifter. He hasn't really made any money off of this. He hasn't really done any of these things. And when he showed up with this handler, and the handlers are a big thing if this is legitimate, because I was shocked that this large woman who I want to say was nearing 7 feet tall was absolutely massive. Almost.
Marcy?
What's that?
Are you talking about Marcy?
I think it is Marcy. Yes.
It's not that big.
Okay, maybe it isn't. Is she now? Well, I'm not sure if it is Marcy. She was blonde. She was tall. I want to say she was from the Eastern Bloc.
Okay, Dan's original wife, Deborah.
Possible.
Okay.
And I know she was armed. You could see the firearm, and she was sort of checking out the room before Dan came in. And I thought, well, this is not your usual entrance, right? So there's a lot about Dan that's not the usual.
Okay, so you're talking about a scenario that I'm not familiar with because I never met him in person. So you might be talking about a security detail that I'm not familiar with. I've come to know a couple of people that are his security people, or at least were back in, let's say, 2017, 2018. One of them is a helicopter pilot, and two of them are cybersecurity, formerly with the Air Force, U.S. Air Force. But yeah, you might be speaking about somebody I'm just unfamiliar with. But when I think of handler, his number one quote handler is Marcy, Marcy McDowell. And interesting, that's a whole other person I can probably look into that I haven't spent much time looking into. Dan's enough as it is. But yeah, I think when you talk about people that have been rolled into the depths of a program of this nature, it's a very kind of esoteric and organic means by which they have to operate and be protected. It doesn't follow normal protocols of, I think, just regular contractors that are being brought into a SAP or a USAP where, yeah, there's probably some phones that have to be tapped and things like that. But no, he had to be watched constantly, and people had to live with him while he was on the program. Very strange. And I mean, I don't know if you remember, but there's some videos on my website of even the apartment complex he lived in Las Vegas was wired up with security cam inside. And sometimes he was recorded, and some of those recordings are up on my website of him, having dialogue with people, and really weird stuff, for sure. Very weird stuff.
And the Vegas aspect is so important because we had a similar figure alluding to similar things from a different angle, more of a propulsion angle, and the mystery regarding the craft, which was Bob Lazar. And of course, George Knapp has sort of teamed up on that side. But at the same time, Bob Lazar had very similar claims. In fact, he claimed that they were aware that his wife was having an affair prior to the fact and started to kind of push him out of the program in anticipation of him finding out. And so, I mean, these are deep-rooted surveillance programs that are full-time jobs just surrounding some of these employees.
Yeah, they would probably call them pretty low-level surveillance, to be honest. The tapping of phones and monitoring when you're actively working on a program is probably normal protocol. But Dan was surrounded by handlers and a doctor and a psychiatrist or a psychologist, and I think that was a little more than Bob was surrounded by. Now, to know the full story of Dan, we can extract that his relationship with supposedly MJ1, which was the former Vice Admiral John Mike McConnell, his very, very tight relationship with him afforded him some privileges. The Dan's story of first being brought into the S4 complex, which is a very, very um, kind of you have to have a very focused attention while you're there, because it's all the work is all that's required. It's a very oppressive kind of environment to enter into, because you're surrounded by ball cameras and security escorting you around. And after a while, Dan had a little more freedom around the facility, and I think that came from his relationship with John, who was MJ1. And so I think that Dan was probably kept alive as well. As you may know, I'm not sure how many of your listeners know, but there's a significant number of government scientists who were brought into programs from the early 2000s. Almost 50 of them had mysterious deaths. And Dan was kept alive, I think, because of his relationship with Mike McConnell.
And his ability to produce, from what I understand. And I wonder, you've kind of entered some information that I didn't know before, like this injury to the back of the head. This may have actually become an asset when engaging with the species, because not many people were getting very far with J-Rod. And it seemed that Dan had this miraculous ability to garner information, and valuable information. Something else that's really interesting, speaking of MJ12, is coming back to Vegas and seeing the many ties with these advanced working groups that both Dan and Bob Lazar and people like you said have these connections to the same advanced working groups, and ultimately some of the same contractors. It seems to me that a lot of these individuals, as you said, especially the ones in charge, I mean, these guys know more than presidents. They are working, I don't want to use the word above the law, but they're not within the bounds of the traditional spectrum of the way things operate. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's what I'm finding out from understanding the deeper side of this. And also what I'm finding out from having side conversations with people who are deep in intelligence, who shared with me, yeah, when you are that deep, the protocols are different. The security measures are different. You're monitored in much deeper ways. And you're shepherded throughout your life. Now, I think that Dan will, for the rest of his days, probably be surrounded by people who are protecting him. And I'd like to think there was still a hope that he could come out with the air of kind of a disclosure that's happening around us right now. Now would be a fantastic time. If he feels so inclined to want to repeat his story, I can't think of a better time than now for him to reconsider, because he originally had planned on addressing Congress and coming out as a whistleblower. And that's why there was many affidavits drawn up of the people around him that were going to support, including his ex-wife that took his actual physical PhD certificate, even vouched in an affidavit that she took it. There was a moment in time where I think Dan was very close to formally lodging a whistleblower status complaint, but apparently it didn't happen.
Hey guys, I know this is a mesmerizing topic we're talking about with Brian Jackson. I absolutely love it. We're going to get right back to it. But really quickly, if you haven't gone over to heroparanormal.com, please check it out. You can subscribe, and for the price of a cup of coffee a month, you can access all the content behind the paywall. There's a ton of it. Also, this is what keeps the podcast going. There's also a little eBay store connected to it. If you see the merchandise over there, that's just a personal eBay store. It's going to be me who sends you a hat, a book, a t-shirt, or anything else you purchase there. All of that also helps support the podcast. And if you're not able to throw $5 a month at the podcast, I get it. Do me another solid. Like, share, and subscribe to the podcasts, because that's the only way that the word gets out. The algorithm buster is out there. There is something that is shadow banning me everywhere. It might be some of the topics that we're discussing, like the one today. But do your best to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. That will help me out more than you would ever know. Hope you're enjoying it. Dan is very interesting in that I don't know if I should use his real name. I'm not sure if that's
It's everywhere. It's Dan Crane.
okay. Yes. Okay. And it's interesting that he also was very spiritual. Come to find out, he was actually a minister. Can you tell us a little bit about that? That shocked me.
Well, early on, before he was rolled into the program, he did go to seminary. He was practicing. He was going to be a priest. I don't know what happened. Maybe the calling ultimately wasn't there. But he remained a Catholic and evolved into what would probably be considered a lapsed Catholic, or one who has expanded his worldview of the faith. To the last days I corresponded with him, and from the last records of him in public, he does wear a, it's not called a yarmulke, it's called something else when it's within the Christian faith. I think he is still a spiritual person, and believes in God, and maybe I think he's probably got a very expanded view of that, and it anchors him, I think, in his from one side of his from the acuity in the sciences and biology to being spiritual. I think is a really great balance for somebody to have. But yeah, I don't think he was a formal, let's say, pastor or minister where he served a flocks of people, anything like that. No.
And during this, let's just call it the 90s, early 90s, he was deployed as part of a black ops unit. And have you looked into that at all, to the Middle East?
Yeah, I have to find my notes. There, he was brought in to assess some biological agent that was being used. It wasn't a very long-term operation, as I understand. It was in the Middle East. I think it was Iraq. I think it was Desert Storm. And it was just to be a scientist to assess some use of a biological or chemical agent, some sort. Yeah.
Yeah. So he was very much, able to deal. He knew about these things. And this is where the neurochemical agents, I'm always fascinated by this. It seems that going back to the Area 51 stuff with J-Rod, that neurochemical agents were administered.
Yes.
And interestingly, if I'm not mistaken, Dan was able to somewhat his mind. How can I put this? Explain the relationship between J-Rod and Dan, because I know you'll do a lot better job than I will.
The relationship of J-Rod to Dan is actually connects back to 1973 or 74 when he was abducted at Mayboy Air Park in Lakewood, California. He was playing catch with his grandfather, and he remembers a large shadow on the field of the baseball field, and he remembers a missing time event. The sun then was at a different trajectory in the sky. His grandfather was sitting against a tree weeping. He didn't know what happened, and it would only be later. And by the way, Dan was an example very much like Dan Sherman, another gentleman who was shepherded very early on in life and guided into programs that would further their scientific aptitude, and in Dan Sherman's case, his psychic aptitude, for eventual possible work with the U.S. government. So when Dan then became aware of the J-Rod species, the J-Rod that he encountered at the S4 complex reminded him of his childhood abduction. And this J-Rod was able to connect with Dan and let him know that was a deliberate soul transfer moment where he was in that abduction episode. He was taken aboard, and this is the stuff you just got to go, okay, I'm just going to let it ride. There's no way you can verify this stuff. But apparently John Mike McConnell's son was dying, and that episode required the soul of John Mike McConnell's son to be put into Dan. And then from then on, Dan suddenly has an acuity in the sciences where before he's just playing with G.I. Joes and watching Beanie and Cecil cartoons. And Dan suddenly is becoming super aware of his scientific aptitude, and there's occasional points in Dan's life as a teenager where John McConnell showed up in his life just to monitor him. So I know this is a really long piece of the story, but there are aspects of Dan's story and Dan Sherman's story, and I'm sure many others, where there are programs even today for children, and there were in the 70s and 80s where children were taken out of school in the middle of the day and taken to facilities to enhance their capabilities in various ways. And somehow that was okay back then. Now you probably can't do it. But these are the kind of programs that were happening back then. And we have like STEM and GATE programs now. Some of them are co-funded by the U.S. government, U.S. Navy. And I think it's among other things to help find if there's some capability of these people, these children, to have exceptional aptitudes and things that might serve them well in programs in the future that we work with. So it's a long-winded answer, but there was a connection, yes.
This is really interesting. This is really interesting. You and I spoke a little bit before the podcast, and I was telling you about my daughter with a kidney infection. And interestingly, we just moved her from schools. And the school that she was at prior, she said she was a part of a Spy Kids program. And that was enough for me. And I mean, she's 6 years old. I mean, but that's another story. The reality is that this is huge when it comes to Dan and the way that he's followed throughout his life. And at some point, it seems as if, at least it's alleged, that Dan kind of defied orders and assisted one of his friends, let's call them aliens, in using a Stargate to return home. And Majestic was not too happy about that. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Apparently, long after Dan thought he was done in the program, the J-Rod that he had worked on in the clean sphere was part of some sort of project that was unfolding in Egypt. And there was a Stargate that needed to be set up. And Dan, at the behest of the J-Rod, was insistent that Dan be there. And I guess there was some sort of psychic transfer. Dan was there, and there was a physical moment. And the J-Rod would have been kept in what Dan referred to as a stroller when they're not in their clean sphere environment because of the physiological makeup and the environmental conditions they have to be in. They convert that down into a bubble-like structure that's on wheels that Dan said it's like a Segway. And it's this stroller that you can push. And there was a fleeting moment, it sounds like, that Dan had an opportunity for the wishes of J-Rod to be pushed through the Stargate. And apparently that's what he did. And Dan actually got a little too close to the Stargate when it happened and blacked out. And he came to sometime later. But yeah, supposedly that's what that story is.
Now, this is fascinating, and what I really like about your research, Brian, is you don't theorize. You just look at what is, and you report on what you find. And I'm going to kind of ask you to push out from that box a little, because what I like about your research is you don't theorize whatsoever. But I'm going to ask you to theorize a little bit, and that is, do you believe that the J-Rod that we're speaking of, these entities, were utilizing potentially the same craft that Bob Lazar talked about in his narratives?
I think it would make sense to play in that sandbox of possibility. I mean, they flew in a craft here. Apparently, the one that Dan worked with was one of 3 that crashed in Kingman, Arizona in 1953. Okay? It was a craft. Based on the great work of Michael Schratt, there's now renderings of what we think that looked like. Could it be derivative of something that Bob worked with? Possibly, yes. I mean, why not go down that road? I mean, they were essentially a gray, 4-finger, 4-toe gray disproportionately large head, small body. Look what Bob worked with. But I think there is the capability that some of the craft that we've seen are possible variations of this same entity that Dan worked with, a variation of a human species in our future that occasionally comes back here. Now, according to Dan, these are from the Gliese 876c star system, but there's a closer planet that's 15 light years away that is a basing planet that they often are at when they visit us here. And that is what J-Rod means. The J and the bar afterward, it represents the number 15, which is supposed to be a basing pair number for the light years that they travel to and from here when they're making visits here. So yeah, I mean, who knows? Maybe I don't have an explanation as to why there's so many variety of craft shapes. I think it's a fascinating aspect to the study of the subject is why the vast variety of shapes. But yeah, I mean, essentially, the one that crashed in Kingman was a round disc shape. Bob worked on a round disc shape. It's not outside the realm of possibility to theorize. Maybe it was one of the same. I mean, they did travel in threes as well. I think the ones that Bob saw were seats of three inside the sport model.
Mm-hmm. And Kingman, there seems to be this, I mean, time and time again, there seems to be this route that sort of ends up in Kingman over and over and over again. There's multiple cases, but I don't want to deflect, but there's so much evidence of multiple craft ending up in Kingman one way or another or close by. So that's really interesting. It echoes throughout a lot of the research. Something very interesting you said is and the P45 and the P52 monikers that are put on these entities, and those being, I'm assuming that would be 52,000 years in the future and then 45,000 years in the future. That's mind-boggling. So in some sense, the human race does survive. This is the good news, but there's a negative aspect to that. Can we go into that a little bit?
Yeah, there's a significant number that do survive and a significant number that don't, apparently. Now, the claim that is around what we're speaking of at the moment is by virtue of a program Dan was brought into in 2007 that lasted like 6 months. He was cut off from all friends and family, and he was part of a team that was going to be using looking glass technology to look into future probable events, of which there was an agreement that timeline 1, variation 83, T1V83, that is the likely probable scenario. And what that forecasted back in 2007 is that there would be a future where Hillary Clinton would become president. There would be a major financial collapse. There'd be a major catastrophic event of some sort. And it required part of us to go underground. Now listen to what happened last week. I forget the woman's name that was speaking about the deep underground military bases we have around the world and under the ocean with Tucker Carlson, of which she thinks is about 170, and that they're there likely for an extinction level event where we are prepared to go underground. Now, I've heard this since the early 90s as well. The research being done, some of these are cities with hospitals and school systems and underground train systems. So there is a significant number of the population that goes underground. There's a significant number of the population that go off planet and live off planet. That would eventually supposedly become the Orions. But for thousands and thousands of years, some of us have to live underground. And the physical environment of that changes our physical makeup because now we're not exposed to the sun and our eyes get bigger and this and this. And then we eventually go off planet at some point in our very distant future. So I don't know if that answers your question, but yes, there is, and this is where I'm thinking there's a heightened sense of interest in the broader, deeper theories as to what's going on with ufology right now. there is talk of a 2027 some sort of event that's going to happen. There's this talk of something in the future is going to happen. The children at the aerial school was shown something that's going to happen. Something's going to happen. So when we take cases like Dan's, where if we're to believe Dan, he was part of a program that looked into future probable events, this may be what happens to our human future lineage going forward.
And these things that was it T1V83?
Yeah.
That's fascinating because there's a lot of things that have been hard to as a society sort of wrap our heads around. And among those is for example, Haim Eshed, the Jewish, I guess their space godfather, let's say. He would be the similar to Werner von Braun for NASA here. And he has had some interesting claims having to do with things called the Galactic Federation, claiming that this is something extraordinarily true, that certain presidential nominees, including Donald Trump, are aware of it. And this T1V83 timeline sounds really interesting because Hillary Clinton very much was close to becoming president. And, then we've had a series of events which are almost too much to accept as reality, everything from, potentially, everything has just been wild. So was there any mention? I know that Dan was very truthful about a lot of things. Was there any mention of anything along the lines of a Galactic Federation or something like that?
A Galactic Federation. I've not heard in so many words from him anything like that. What I'm also aware, which I want to make sure to impart, is that there were agreements drawn up. And Dan spoke of these because he was in attendance to at least one of these, where there were multiple species meeting with the human dignitaries of some sort, and they meet every 9 years, and they were called the Tau 9 treaties, and the Tau 9 treaties were revisited. I think it was every 9 years, and insofar as we can take the idea of a federation being a conglomerate of different species working together towards some sort of common agreement, these apparently did happen. And Dan had seen this. And I think this is important. I think this is very important because if you remember Ross Coulthard's interview of David Grush, he tried to press him on that question. Do we have agreements? And David Grush didn't feel comfortable saying no to that. He essentially deflected an answer that still left open the possibility that that could be true, and he's looking into it. And I think that's amazing, because if that is true, we may not be in control of the decisions that are happening around us. The anger that we have around disclosure, that this group that is maintaining that we're not going to get it, that may be a decision by virtue of treaties or agreements that are outside their hands. Maybe that's an agreement by the visitors. You cannot tell them, and they're going to double down and make sure that we don't know. So I think we have to exercise that possibility with a lot of the decision making we think that's happening behind the scenes, and wondering what the rationale is of it. We want things to come out to the public. We want things to be made true to everybody. We may not know that it's not supposed to happen yet. Just want to throw that out.
This is absolutely fascinating. If there is this exchange taking place, which it seems evident that there are some agreements, right? And if that's the case, is it beyond comprehension that some of these people, or is it beyond the possibility, the scope of possibility, that we have so many people that are claiming there could be for lack of a better word, this false alien invasion. A number of people, including Jeremy Corbell, had a warning about UFOs and an upcoming alien invasion that he said was not what it appeared. We had people who have talked about things along the lines of Project Bluebeam for decades. Was there any mention of any of these, I guess, disinformation campaigns as being a possibility in your research of Dan Burisch?
In my research of Dan Burisch, I was not aware of anything that sounded like there was going to be a false representation of the reality of this. I've since heard it from many others, but no, and I would wonder what that is, what that would be for. Is it a test? Is it like, COVID? Some people think COVID was kind of a test. How will the world react when there's a common threat and we all have to cooperate towards a common, dealing with this situation? Maybe that's what that would be if that happens in the future. Test the American people. We're being possibly tested now with the drone situation. How is the media handling this? How is the public handling this? Or it's a real invasion. I don't know. But it makes you wonder. But I think let me make this point again. I think if we move forward and try to rationalize the things that we're understanding with the idea that there might be agreements, we might consider that there's alternatives that are outside of our hands and being made by the NHI.
That's critical. I mean, if we are up against an emergency, and I know everybody has their opinions on things, but yeah, there may be a scenario where we all have to play on the same team, and this is critical knowledge essential to potentially the survival of humanity. Interesting and fascinating issue. To kind of go into a different direction, which is this clean sphere technology, which I found mesmerizing. This clean sphere that Dan would go in and work in. There have been other locations that are outside of Area 51 that have been allegedly made as clean rooms or clean buildings. Among those, a number of them come to mind. Some of them are private contractors like Bigelow Aerospace in northern Las Vegas. Has anything you've come across alluded to the possibility that some of these private contractors, and names don't have to be given, but that some of these private contractors may in fact be in possession of extraterrestrial craft?
Oh, I think that's coming out very clearly now based on the whistleblower testimony. Private contractors have been back engineering this technology. Now, as it relates to, let's call them visitor types, grays, you don't need to go any further than understanding the testimony of milab cases to understand that during those events, and those are specifically ones where it's a human abduction, and they're taken to facilities where they're seeing human beings and aliens working together. No, these are not clean spheres. These seem to be laboratories, underground military facilities, things that look like they're man-made. I've heard that a lot, and I'm aware also that one of the milab cases I investigated was in the Upper Mojave area near China Lake, and this woman was taken to a facility that I believe is one of the facilities that Jake Barber had access to. And it was one where she was taken that she saw clearly men and aliens working together. And in one of her episodes, they were at her house together. A gentleman was wearing Air Force dress blues, and he was Chinese looking, and he was directing the aliens to take her out of the house. He was barking orders at them to do their job and get her out of the house. And this was a full waking abduction. I have that actually on audio tape, the whole thing, because they wanted to help find who that officer was, because she got his name. So yeah, so in that realm of this idea of, we have clean spheres. Dan worked in a clean sphere, replicating the environmental conditions necessary to keep this J-Rob, which is apparently from off planet. Well, listen to the abduction episodes from milabs. They're living here in laboratories and underground, if we're to believe that.
This may seem far fetched, but I live in
Vegas. What we're talking about is
I live in Vegas, and a lot of the things that you've talked about, I just recently was speaking with somebody I know really well who's in the movie industry, and he had a close friend that was working out at, let's just say, one of the bases, and died mysteriously after there was an investigation of what they thought were papers going missing, and this individual's wife was sure that he was taken out. I won't use names, but it was a forklift accident, which, forklifts, these things, sure, they happen, but interestingly enough, this gentleman who has nothing to do with it other than the wife telling him the story and having the mutual friend who passed, he, sure enough, said that after she told him the story, he noticed that there was what he would call orbs going around his house. And in one situation, he actually found documentation in the woman's house. He was doing something for her. And I don't want to go into specifics, but he looked in a drawer or something and he saw something that he took as, yeah, he probably did take some of these papers. But this is very common in Vegas. I talk to people all the time who work in and around some of these intelligence circles, and it's not so much what they say, but what they don't say, that you start to realize that there's a very real aspect, that there are these advanced groups, private contractors, there are intelligence scenarios happening all the time, and a lot of them are aware of it. They just don't talk about it. And Dan alludes to something similar. He has a very interesting saying where he says, "The more I know, the more I owe." Can you explain what that means?
I'm trying to remember what he said that in context to. Well, listen, the knowledge that he would have about the depth of the program that's operating in secret, which at the time he was there was called Majestic, and then the Committee of Majority. These are circles of people that they operate in the darkest shadows possible, because they're making decisions that affect a lot of mankind in the relationship to this understanding we have with agreements with NHI. But I think the growing knowledge that you are made aware of how deep these things go, and Dan would have had that knowledge, these programs, the way they operate, the security measures involved, that they would, without question, end somebody's life if it meant continuing with the operation. These are very dark subjects. So yes, I think when you're at the level Dan was, you were sold to the program. Your life is given over to the program. You will never live a life like we're enjoying right now. And so the more I owe, the more I know, the more I owe is probably inferring something to that effect, that, yeah, he owes everything to them because he's already too deep into it.
Such a fascinating story. And why, as we start to kind of wrap up here, why do you think, and it's evident with the example you gave of Grush in his testimony, why do you think that the narrative is being steered more towards the technology behind and the propulsion systems behind some of these NHI encounters, and steered away from the quote-unquote biologics or anything that has to do with the entities themselves? It seems like that's kind of poo-pooed, like don't go there. Don't go into the actual biologics. Let's concentrate on this cleaner scenario of what did they leave behind? Why do you think that's being handled that way?
It's a more palatable way to gauge interest in the subject. If we're to believe there is a narrative that is being choreographed before our very eyes, you would probably go to the nuts and bolts, craft, things that scientists can get a hold of and understand. And boy, this seems to be off-world. That's a very, very easy gateway into the subject that I think the general public could grasp. They don't want to know about aliens. They don't want to know about abductions. But if you claim that we've got some sort of object that we don't understand how it works, call it a craft, call it a piece of metal, that's a very palatable and very safe means by which we can gauge the reaction. And the media would be friendly towards that as well, because they're not being asked to exercise anything more than just their understanding of technology and physical manifestation of something otherworldly.
Sure. You don't have to disclose as much.
No, it could be, and we might get a bone thrown our way through this idea that we're having hearings. There seems to be a lot of stuff going on now in Congress. We may get something thrown our way to silence us for a while. That doesn't open the door to criticize the U.S. government. There may be something given to us, but they don't want us to talk about the entities. They don't want us to talk about the deep, dark parts of the government, agreements, abductions, who's in control of those, what are those for? That is off the table. No question.
It's a super provocative. This is such an interesting area of research and study. Thank you so much. And Brian, tell people where they can support your research, donate to your research, find your research, and anything else you have going on.
Yeah, well, the website is the main thing. I've been doing this for 37 years. I've been out of the major, I don't do speaking engagements and things. I just recently decided to, because I'm seeing interest, and I think the Dan's case needs to be reassessed. So I put together the website. Listen, if you feel, if you want to throw a $1 or $2 my way, there is a link there for Patreon. I am not by any means living off that. I'm a successful, I have my own business. I'm doing great. But that website is the main thing, and check in often because I'm going to be uploading more and more stuff. And I really invite people to go deep and be open to criticizing it with respect and provide me some feedback. My initial effort in collating this and going out was to go out to the major researchers who've investigated Dan, Michael Schratt, Linda Howe, Paula Harris. I presented to Ross Coulthard. I presented to a number of others wanting their feedback. And I was like, give me some honest, open feedback. You can criticize it, but give me something rational that makes sense that you can criticize about it. I want to know what this is. Why did it go dark? This entire case needs to be re-examined. So the website is the main way to contact me.
This is great. Thanks so much for taking time out of your busy day, Brian. Appreciate you so much.
Thanks. Appreciate the opportunity.
Esoteric Research Organization. Hero paranormal, always setting up the pace, man. Crop circle tipping, Illuminati still tripping. Making those ears perk up, gonna make you question your earth. You better. Mystery bloodlines and secret society. Creepy shapeshifter says, come sit beside me. Yeah, cozy on up. So what's with all this spiral, acting like UFOs? Say what? So Bigfoot and Space Wolf tiptoe through the dark. Third eye blinding, tune in and blast off, blast off. Blast off, baby. Blast off.